Hi, it's Zeke with the Eastside Church of Christ in Baytown, Texas. Thanks for joining us today as we consider the topic of today's study, Consider One Another. The Bible says a lot about the attitude that we ought to have, not only towards God, but also towards one another as well. And we're going to be taking our cue from Hebrews chapter 10, verses 23 through 25. If you've got a Bible, I'd invite you to open it up with us. We're going to begin reading right away. Hebrews chapter 10, read with me beginning in verse 23. The inspired writer says, "Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. And let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near." There are some things he tells us here that are going to form the foundation of what we're hoping to learn today. One of those is that first of all, we consider God and his faithfulness. Did you notice that in verse 23? He tells us that he who promised is faithful. So as we consider God and his faithfulness towards us, the idea is that it ought to prompt us to consider our faithfulness and our devotion to one another. And verses 24 and 25 are all about that. Because we consider the faithfulness of God. We consider one another. How we can stir one another up, he says. How we can get one another motivated to live better lives for Christ. Better lives for one another. And of utter importance in all of this is that God hasn't left us on our own. He's given us a spiritual family. He's given us an opportunity to where we can relate to one another from a basis of love. I know you know this verse, but let's turn to it together. John chapter 13. John 13. In John 13, Jesus talks about something that would be a delineating factor among those who are his followers. In John chapter 13, begin with me, if you will, in verse 34. Jesus says, "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also are to love one another, and by this all people will know that you're my disciples, if you have love for one another." So what Hebrews chapter 10 is calling us to is to practice this love for one another that Jesus has called us to aim towards one another. And of course, Jesus gives us his own example there in John 13. This selfless, compassionate, considerate, sacrificial love. So how are we going to do this? How are we going to fulfill this command that Jesus gives us and that the Hebrew writer by inspiration calls us to? Well, we're going to consider one another. And we're going to consider one another first as family. God grouped us together in local churches so that we can accomplish the work that he has for us to do in our community. But we're not just people who get together and worship, and we're not just people who get together to do the work that God has called us to. We're more than that. Even though we are imperfect people who were called together to be a family, to be a household, and that's exactly how the Word of God describes us. In 1 Timothy 3 and verse 15, Paul says, "If I delay, you may know how one ought to behave himself in the household of God, which is the church of the living God." Same apostle in Ephesians 2 says, "You are no longer strangers and aliens, but you are fellow citizens with the saints and members of the household of God." Do you see how he keeps drawing the circle tighter and tighter? No longer strangers and aliens, but fellow citizens, and even more than that, your family members in the household of God. Therefore, it gives us a basis on how we can approach one another, how we can relate to one another in this sphere of relationship that God has placed us in. And it forms the basis of how we can discuss with one another, how we can stir one another up to those love and good deeds that the Hebrew writer was calling us to. Look with me in 1 Timothy chapter 5. 1 Timothy chapter 5. In 1 Timothy 5, look at the first couple of verses with me. 1 Timothy 5 and verses 1 and 2 tell us, "Do not rebuke an older man, but encourage him as you would a father. Younger men as brothers, older women as mothers, younger women as sisters in all purity. So it tells us a couple of things here. One is that there is a respect in our relationship. He tells us that because we are family members, we treat one another as family members. And that respect in relationship controls our kinship. He tells us it's the very foundation or the basis of how we're going to relate to one another when maybe sometimes there are difficult things to say. So, as with any family, we need to consider how we can help other family members in the good times and the bad times. And so the overriding question that I want you to keep asking yourself throughout this lesson is simply this: how can I use whatever talents I may have to help someone else in the family, to help someone else in my family, the family of God? Now here's one way. We need to consider one another in physical weakness. There are some who are going through some difficult things, and every congregation is the same. There's always someone who needs some kind of help in some form or fashion. And Jesus tells us that blessing others is blessing Him. In Matthew chapter 5, if you'll go there with me, Matthew chapter 25, Matthew chapter 25, Jesus talks about this final judgment scene that begins there in verse 31, and he says there's going to be a time when He's going to recognize things that were done for others. And He says there in verse 36, I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. I was naked and you clothed me. I was sick and you visited me. I was in prison and you came to me. And it says that the righteous are going to ask Him, when did we do these things? We don't remember doing any of these for you. When did we do these things? And in verse 40, Jesus says, the king will answer them, truly I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of these my brothers, you did it to me. And then He says that there are those whom He's going to cast out from His presence. Those who did not do these things, all that He talked about before, and they're going to say, when didn't we do these things to you? And in verse 46, verse 45, Jesus says, truly I say to you, as you did not do it to one of the least of these. These who? These my brothers, those who were in the family or the household of God. You did not do it to me. So blessing others is blessing Jesus. How closely He identifies with those who are His own. Now, I recognize that sometimes people won't ask for help for one reason or another. I've heard some brethren just say, I've always done for myself, and if I can't do for myself, then I just won't do it. What they do is they preclude others from receiving the blessing of blessing others. So when someone won't ask for the help that they need, then it becomes incumbent upon us to recognize the opportunity to give that help. In 1 John chapter 3, go there with me, 1 John chapter 3. In 1 John 3, begin with me in verse 16. It says, by this we know love, that He laid down His life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for the brothers. Now we'll stop right there. Now, how many of us are actually willing to do that? To lay down our physical lives for the physical life of someone else? Well, Jesus says, you may not have to go that far. There are other ways that you can lay down your life or the things in your life for someone else. He says in verse 17, if anyone has the world's goods and sees his brother in need, yet closes his heart against him, how does God's love abide in him? Little children, let us not love in word or talk, but in deed and in truth. So the idea here is that we need to be ready to recognize when help is needed of us and be ready to give it. Sometimes it'll be difficult, sometimes it'll be inconvenient. But Jesus says there is nothing greater there's nothing that shows love than the giving of yourself to someone else. He says, if you don't do that, how does God's love abide in you? So look around to your brethren. Who's in need? Who needs help in a physical way? What can you do to alleviate that need in their life? Chances are there's something you can do, and there's some talent that you have. It might be mowing the lawn for one of our widows. It might be helping somebody move furniture. It might be any of a number of things that just says, I want to help. That'll be a blessing to them. Need to consider one another also, though, not only in physical weakness, but also in spiritual weakness. I know that sometimes sin is difficult to resist, and it gets the better of all of us, and there isn't a one of us who doesn't stumble. Even Paul the Apostle talked about his own struggle in Romans chapter 7. In Romans chapter 7, Paul talks about this struggle that he had. Read with me beginning in verse 19. Romans 7 beginning in verse 19. In Romans 7 verse 19, Paul says, I don't do the good that I want, but the evil I do not want. That's what I keep doing. Now if I do what I do not want, it is no longer I who does it, but sin that dwells within me. Now let's just think about that for a moment. Who of us can't relate? Who of us knows the right thing to do and yet doesn't do it? Who of us does something that after we're done with it, we slap ourselves upside the head and we think to ourselves, I knew better than that. I shouldn't have done that. And yet we do it anyway. Paul continues to say in verse 21, I find it to be a law that when I want to do right, evil lies close at hand. For I delight in the law of God, in my inner being. But I see in my members another law, waging war against the law of my mind and making me captive to the law of sin that dwells in my members. He says, I want to do right, and I know what's right, but I've got this struggle that's going on, and sometimes he says, well, the wrong wins, in spite of how well I know the right thing to do. And that's the truth of it. Everybody stumbles. But we can't use that as an excuse. We all stumble. But still, we have a responsibility to one another. In the book of Galatians, if you make a right with me to the book of Galatians, in Galatians chapter 6, the same apostle Paul, in fact, talks about that very responsibility. In Galatians 6 and in verse 1, he says, Brothers, if anyone is caught in any transgression, you who are spiritual should restore him in a spirit of gentleness, keeping watch on yourself, lest you too be tempted. Bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. This whole passage is one of spiritual importance. In fact, the focus is a spiritual one. We need to look to one another, and we need to be ready to recognize when someone is struggling with sin and help them out of that. And this implies that sometimes there's going to be uncomfortable conversations. There may be truthful, earnest confrontation, uncomfortable confrontation maybe, that takes place in the hopes of winning someone back. Jesus talked about it in Matthew chapter 18 and verse 15 when he said, if your brother sins, go and show him his fault in private. If he listens to you, you've won your brother. And that's really what it's all about. It's not about pointing an accusing finger at someone so that we can gloat when they slip up. And it's not even about winning an argument to prove someone is wrong. It's about getting someone to recognize their offense against God. And even though we stumble with maybe the same difficulties sometimes, it's about recognizing that there's help available for all of us, and sometimes that help is one another. Considering one another with this kind of attitude is going to maybe help somebody else to keep from straying from the truth. Go with me to James chapter 5. James chapter 5. In James 5, look with me in verse 19. James 5 and in verse 19. The inspired writer says, My brothers, if anyone among you wanders from the truth and someone brings him back, Let him know that whoever brings back a sinner from his wandering will save his soul from death and will cover a multitude of sins. How many sins could we maybe prevent in the future by helping someone come back, grabbing them from the precipice of that pit? Who knows the good that we can do if we just consider one another in times of spiritual weakness? That means that sometimes there's going to have to be some uncomfortable conversations, but they're crucial conversations that need to take place. Remember what Cain asked God, "Am I my brother's keeper?" Well, to some extent, yes, we are. We have responsibility to one another. Consider also one another in times of joy and sorrow. See, Paul reminds us simply that this is also part of our duty to one another. In Romans chapter 12 and in verse 15, he said simply, "Rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep." In 1 Corinthians 12 and in verse 26, he wrote, "If one member suffers, all suffer together. If one member is honored, all rejoice together." I think that's kind of part of what that old Three Musketeers motto was all about. All for one and one for all, right? We're all in this together. We recognize that what happens to one happens to all. And there are reasons where we can rejoice. And naturally, it's easier to rejoice with somebody because everybody likes good times, right? And it's easy to be happy when those good things happen. But sorrow is a different critter. Sometimes when someone is going through discouragement or depression, they tend to isolate themselves from others. Maybe they think that no one else could understand what I'm going through, and so they just take themselves away. Well, it's up to us to recognize that sometimes misery does love company. Sometimes misery needs company. And it's up to us to be with one another. One of the things I love most about the beginning of the book of Job is that when Job was going through his difficulty, his friends came, and the implication is that some of them came from far away to be with him. And for a week, they didn't say anything. They just sat with him, and they shared his misery. Of course, the problem opened for them when it came up for them when they opened their mouth. But for a full week, the book of Job just says they just sat there with him. They were just with him. And sometimes that's the best thing that you can do for someone. Too often we overlook the times when we need one another most. As I said, it's easy to be with somebody and share their joy when something good happens to them. But it's another thing entirely when someone needs the shoulder to lean on, maybe even the shoulder to cry on when things aren't going so well. And if our relationship is right, then we'll empathize with one another. Because at some point, we've all been there. And none of this is going to happen unless we believe first and foremost that we are one, that we are many members but one body. In 1 Corinthians chapter 12, in verses 24 and 25, Paul says, "God has so composed the body, giving greater honor to the part that lacked it, that there may be no division in the body, but that the members may have the same care for one another." Everybody equal. Everybody needs everybody. Paul said in Philippians chapter 2, in verses 3 and 4, "Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others." I hope that you'll find a way today to consider someone else, to consider one another, to think about some way that you can help your brother or sister. Remember the question I began with, beginning of this lesson? I wanted it to be in the back of your mind. How can I use my talents, whatever they are, whatever abilities that God has given you, how can I use that to help my brother, or my sister, chances are, whether it's in a physical or a spiritual way, there's something that you can do. So let's make it our point from now on to consider one another. Well, thanks for joining us today. God bless you.